Tonight, we're going to challenge an image that has been etched into your mind since childhood. We will question the very foundation of a story passed down through generations. What if the Garden of Eden was never actually a garden? And what if we already know where it truly was located? Imagine for a moment that you could travel back 4,000 years in time. Not to a lush orchard of apple trees and talking serpents, but to a dimly lit chamber. Inside, a Sumerian scribe meticulously presses his reed stylus into moist clay. Outside, the Mesopotamian sun relentlessly beats down on the streets of Nippur. But in here, within the temple's cool embrace, this man is transcribing something ancient, even to him. He's recording the story of a place called Dilmun, a realm untouched by sickness, free from death, where gods walked among men. The most remarkable thing? This scribe is describing the very same place that, 1,000 years later, another people would call Eden. The same geography, the same rivers, the same promise of lost immortality. Before we delve further, please do me a favor. Give this video a like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments from what corner of the world you're listening and what time it is there right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft, ambient hum, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. What you're about to hear in the next hour isn't an attack on any sacred tradition, nor a conspiracy theory about what's being hidden from us. It's something more subtle and perhaps more fascinating. The possibility that multiple ancient civilizations, separated by centuries and cultures, were all describing the same real place. A place that existed. A place we can pinpoint on a map. And a place that, according to some theories, still lies beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf. Everything begins with a question that almost no one asks. What does the word we translate as garden truly mean? When the first European translators encountered the Hebrew text of Genesis, they found the word gone and translated it as garden because it was the closest equivalent they knew. Cultivated, ordered space, filled with plants. The image became forever fixed in the Western imagination. Think of any artistic representation of Eden you've ever seen. It likely includes leafy trees, a winding river, perhaps a pair of deer grazing in the grass. Adam and Eve, naked but strategically covered by leaves, stroll among the flowers. It's a bucolic scene, almost pastoral, a glorified orchard. But there's a problem with this image. It doesn't match what the original text actually describes. Genesis doesn't speak of a place where vegetables are grown. It speaks of an enclosure where God himself walks in the cool of the evening. A place guarded by cherubim with fiery swords. A sanctuary so sacred that, once humans were expelled, they could never return. Does that sound like an orchard to you? Scholars have pointed out for decades something that the casual reader overlooks. The vocabulary that Genesis uses to describe Eden is temple vocabulary. The Hebrew verbs that define Adam's function, abad and shamar, are exactly the same verbs that would later describe the functions of the Levite priests in the tabernacle. The entrance is to the east, guarded by celestial figures, exactly like the entrance to Solomon's temple. Water flows from the inside out, exactly as Ezekiel would prophesy about the eschatological temple. What the ancient Hebrews were describing wasn't a botanical garden. It was a sanctuary, a sacred mountain, the place where heaven touched earth. And this is where the story becomes truly interesting, because the Hebrews weren't the first to describe this place. 1,000 years before Genesis was written, in the city-states of Sumeria, scribes were already recording stories about a primordial paradise. They called it Dilmun, and the coincidences with the biblical Eden are so numerous, so specific, that it's difficult to attribute them to chance. The Sumerian tablets describe Dilmun as a pure place, a bright place, a place where the lion doesn't kill, where the wolf doesn't snatch the lamb, a place where disease doesn't exist, where old age doesn't touch its inhabitants. The god Enki and the goddess Ninhursag dwell there, and from their actions springs the creation of plant life and eventually the cosmic order. Does a perfect place inhabited by deities, where death and suffering don't exist, from which life itself springs, protected and inaccessible to ordinary mortals, sound familiar? But there's more. The Sumerian tablets place Dilmun in a specific geographical location. It's not a mythical place floating in some abstract heaven. It's somewhere to the east, where the sun rises over the waters. Archaeologists and historians have identified this location with the region of modern-day Bahrain in the Persian Gulf, an island that in ancient times was famous for its freshwater springs that gushed even beneath the salty sea. Fresh water emerging from the salty depths. An oasis in the middle of the Gulf, a place where Sumerian merchants traveled to obtain copper, pearls, and, according to the texts, something more intangible, contact with the sacred. Now consider this. Genesis describes Eden as a place from which 4 rivers flow. 2 of them, the Tigris and the Euphrates, exist today, and anyone can find them on a map. The other 2, the Pishon and the Gin, supposedly disappeared. For centuries, scholars assumed they were mythical names, literary inventions. But in recent decades, satellite imagery has revealed something extraordinary beneath the sands of Arabia. Dry riverbeds, ancient channels that once carried water, but have been buried under the desert for millennia. And some of these channels appear to converge towards a specific point. The northern region of the Persian Gulf, the same region where the Sumerians located Dilmun. A theory, supported by geologists and archaeologists, proposes the following. Approximately 10,000 years ago, sea levels were significantly lower than they are today. The Persian Gulf didn't exist as we know it. Instead, there was a fertile valley fed by rivers flowing down from the mountains of Turkey and the plateaus of Arabia. A veritable garden in the middle of what is now desert and saltwater. And then, gradually, the sea rose. The ice from the last ice age melted. The waters advanced. And that fertile valley, that place where perhaps some of the first sedentary human communities arose, was submerged forever. Could this be the origin of the myth? An ancestral memory, passed down from generation to generation, of a perfect place that the sea swallowed? The Sumerians remembered it as Dilmun. The Hebrews called it Eden. The Persians would speak of a paradisa, a walled garden from which, curiously, our word paradise derives. Different names, different cultures, different eras, but perhaps the same place. Tonight, we're going to explore each of these connections. We're going to delve into the ancient texts, from the cuneiform tablets of Mesopotamia to the Hebrew scrolls, from the Book of Enoch to Gilgamesh. We're going to examine the geographical, linguistic, and archaeological evidence. And we're going to ask ourselves something that is rarely asked. What if Eden wasn't just a metaphor? What if we could point to it on a map? But to understand all this, we first need to unlearn what we think we know. We need to forget the apples and the serpents. We need to look beyond the image of the paradisiacal orchard. Because Eden, according to the oldest texts, was never a garden. It was something much bigger. Words are containers of meaning, but they are also prisons. Once a word becomes fixed in our mind with a particular image, it becomes almost impossible to see beyond it. And few words have suffered as much from this distortion as the one we translate as garden when we speak of Eden. The Hebrew text of Genesis uses the expression Gan Beden. For centuries, this was translated as the Garden of Eden, and that translation shaped our entire understanding of the story. But let's analyze each element separately, because the surprises begin here. The word Gan in Hebrew effectively means an enclosed space where plants grow, but the meaning goes beyond the merely botanical. A Gan was a protected enclosure, a place set apart from the outside world, frequently associated with royalty or the sacred. The kings of the ancient Near East had their Gan, their private gardens, but these weren't orchards where food was grown. They were spaces for recreation, and more importantly, spaces of symbolic meaning. They represented order versus chaos, civilization versus the wild. Now consider the word Eden. Here, the translation becomes even more revealing. Eden in Hebrew derives from a root that means delight or pleasure, but this same root is related to an Akkadian word, Edenu, which means plain or steppe. The Akkadians were neighbors of the Sumerians and shared with them much of their worldview. And for the Mesopotamian peoples, the steppe wasn't a negative place. It was the primordial space, the place where the gods had brought order before the creation of the civilized world. So Gan Beden could be more accurately translated as the sacred enclosure in the primordial plane, or even the sanctuary of divine delight. It doesn't sound so much like an apple orchard anymore. But let's go further. Let's look at what words the Sumerians used to describe their version of paradise. Dilmun, the Sumerian name for the primordial paradise, isn't a word that means garden. The Sumerians had specific words for gardens and orchards, but they didn't use them for Dilmun. Instead, Dilmun appears in the texts as a place, a land, a region. Some scholars believe that the name derives from a root that means complete or pure. Others suggest connections with words that mean radiant or bright. What's clear is that Dilmun, in the Sumerian mind, wasn't an agricultural space. It was a cosmic place, a point of connection between the world of the gods and the world of men. The Sumerian texts describe Dilmun with a language that specialists call mythical geography. This doesn't mean that it's invented, but that it mixes real geographical elements with symbolic meanings. Dilmun is in the east, where the sun rises, where the origin of light is. It's surrounded by waters, but by primordial waters, the waters of Apsu, the subterranean ocean of fresh water that the Sumerians believed existed beneath the earth. And here an extraordinary coincidence appears. Genesis describes that a river flows from Eden, which then divides into 4 branches. The water flows from Eden outward, not inward. This means that Eden is at an elevated point, a source from which the waters spring. The Sumerians described Dilmun similarly, as the place where Enki, the god of fresh waters, had established his dwelling. From there, the fresh water flowed into the world. Both traditions are describing the same thing, an elevated, sacred place from which the water of life springs. But the most impactful linguistic parallel we find is in the function assigned to the first man. Genesis says that God put man in the garden to till it and keep it. In Hebrew, the verbs are abad and shamar. For a long time, these verbs were interpreted in an agricultural sense. Adam was to cultivate the garden and take care of the plants. He was, according to this reading, the first gardener. But there's a problem. These same 2 verbs, abad and shamar, appear together in another very specific context within the Hebrew Bible, the description of the functions of the Levites in the tabernacle and the temple. The Levites were to abad, serve or minister, and shamar, guard or keep, the sacred sanctuary. This isn't a casual coincidence. Biblical Hebrew has a broad vocabulary, and the sacred writers chose their words carefully. To use exactly the same verbs to describe the function of Adam in Eden and the function of the priests in the temple is a deliberate signal. The author wanted his readers to understand something. Adam wasn't a gardener. He was a priest. And Eden wasn't an orchard. It was a sanctuary. Dr. Michael Heiser, a scholar of the Old Testament and Semitic languages, has dedicated much of his career to exploring these connections. In his work, he argues that ancient readers of Genesis would have immediately understood what we, separated by millennia of cultural distance, overlook. For them, Eden was cosmic geography. It was the place where heaven touched earth, where the divine and the human could meet face to face. And this reading resolves several mysteries of the text that would otherwise be confusing. Why are there cherubim guarding the entrance with fiery swords? Because the cherubim were the traditional guardians of sacred spaces in the ancient Near East. They appear on the Ark of the Covenant in Solomon's temple in the Assyrian palaces. They didn't guard orchards. They guarded the places where divinity dwelt. Why does God walk in Eden in the cool of the evening? Because Eden was his earthly dwelling, the place where he had chosen to dwell among men. The same terminology is later used to describe the presence of God in the tabernacle. Why does the sin of Adam and Eve result in permanent expulsion, with the way back blocked forever? Because impurity cannot coexist with holiness. By disobeying, the first humans became impure. And what is impure cannot remain in the sanctuary. It's the same logic that will later govern all the laws of purity in Leviticus. Everything fits when we stop thinking about orchards and start thinking about temples. But there's another word that we must examine, one that doesn't appear in the Hebrew Genesis, but that shapes our entire imagination of Eden, the word paradise. This word came into Spanish through the Greek paradisos, which in turn took it from the ancient Persian paradisa. And here the etymology is revealing. Pyri means around, and disa means wall. A paradisa was literally a walled space, an enclosed enclosure. The Persian kings built these walled enclosures as spaces for hunting, recreation, and exhibition of their power. They were gardens, yes, but not in the sense of productive orchards. They were physical manifestations of the cosmic order that the king imposed on chaos. Within the paradisa, everything was controlled, organized, perfect. Outside was the wild world. When the Greek translators of the Bible, back in the 3rd century BC, looked for a word to translate Gan Eden, they chose paradisos, probably because it evoked the idea of a sacred, separate, perfect enclosure. But in doing so, they unwittingly introduced the entire Persian cultural baggage into the biblical imaginary. And so, through layers of translation, we went from a Hebrew cosmic sanctuary to a Persian walled garden, to our modern image of an orchard with apple trees. Each translation added its own distortion. Each culture projected its own meanings. But if we clean all those layers, if we go back to the oldest texts, we find something different. We find an elevated place from which rivers flow, an enclosure guarded by celestial beings, a dwelling where the divine and the human coexisted, a sanctuary that, because of sin, was closed forever. And most intriguingly of all, we find that this same description appears in texts much older than Genesis. The Sumerians came first. Sometime around 2000 BC, a scribe in the city of Nippur dipped his reed stylus in water, pressed it against a fresh clay tablet, and began to trace the cuneiform signs of an ancient story. He wasn't inventing anything. He was transcribing an account that was already old when he was born, an oral tradition that his people had transmitted for countless generations. The story spoke of a place called Dilmun. The tablet that this scribe produced, along with other similar ones found in archaeological excavations, allows us today to read what the Sumerians believed about the origin of the world and about the primordial paradise. And what we read is extraordinarily familiar. The text begins with a description of Dilmun before the gods organized it. It's a pure place, a bright place, but it's also an incomplete place. There's no fresh water that springs from the earth. The sun hasn't yet established its regular course. It is, in a certain sense, a space in potential waiting to be activated by the divine will. Then Enki intervenes, the god of fresh waters, of wisdom, and of creative magic. Enki orders that fresh water spring from the ground, and with the water comes life. Plants begin to grow, animals populate the earth. Dilmun transforms from potential into act, from promise into reality. But the most remarkable thing about the Sumerian description is what Dilmun doesn't have. The text says, in one of the most accepted translations, in Dilmun the raven doesn't croak. The bird of death doesn't pronounce the cry of death. The lion doesn't kill. The wolf doesn't snatch the lamb. Unknown is the wild dog devouring kids. Do you recognize this language? It's the same language that the prophet Isaiah will use centuries later to describe the future messianic kingdom. The wolf will dwell with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the goat. It's the language of primordial peace, of the original state before violence entered the world. But there's more. The Sumerian text continues, the maiden doesn't purify herself. No man in the city says, I am making the maiden purify herself. No old woman in Dilmun says, I am an old woman. No old man in Dilmun says, I am an old man. In other words, in Dilmun there is no ritual impurity associated with menstruation. There is no old age. There is no decay of the human body. The inhabitants of Dilmun remain in a state of perpetual youth. This isn't simply a pleasant garden. This is a state of being completely different from the one we know. It's the absence of everything that makes human existence difficult. Violence, impurity, aging, death. It is not exactly what Genesis describes, albeit with different words. A place where death did not exist until sin introduced it. A place where humans walked with God without the need for ritual purification. A place of original fullness that was lost. Now, there is a crucial difference between the Sumerian and the biblical accounts, and it's important to point it out so as not to fall into oversimplifications. In the Sumerian myth, Dilmun is not lost through human sin. The narrative is different. Enki eats certain sacred plants. Ninhursag curses him. Then she forgives him and creates new deities to heal each part of his sick body. It's a story of gods, not of humans. But what both traditions share is the notion of a perfect primordial place, an original state of things before something went wrong. And both traditions place this place in a recognizable geography, because Dilmun was not, for the Sumerians, a purely mythical place. Sumerian and Akkadian commercial texts mention Dilmun as a center of mercantile activity. Ships departed from Ur and other coastal cities towards Dilmun, carrying textiles and silver, and returned loaded with copper, pearls, and precious stones. Dilmun was real, had a king, paid tribute. Archaeologists have identified this historical Dilmun with the islands of Bahrain and the adjacent coast of Saudi Arabia in the Persian Gulf. Excavations in Bahrain have revealed a sophisticated civilization that flourished during the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC, with temples, palaces, and enormous necropolises that suggest a prosperous population. But here comes the interesting part. Bahrain was famous in antiquity for something very specific: its freshwater springs. In a region dominated by the desert and the salty sea, Bahrain had sources of fresh water that gushed even under the ocean. Pearl divers knew these underwater springs and used them to drink during their dives. Fresh water emerging from the salt sea. To an ancient mind, this must have seemed genuinely miraculous. It was as if the waters of Apsu, the primordial ocean of fresh water that the Sumerians believed existed beneath the earth, were surfacing in this specific place. It is not exactly what you would expect to find at home. Enki, the god of fresh waters, looms large in this narrative. The connection between the mythical Dilmun and the historical Dilmun is a complex tapestry, woven with threads of speculation and conjecture. Can we definitively say that the Sumerians chose Bahrain as the location for their paradise because it already possessed freshwater springs? Or, conversely, did the springs of Bahrain inspire the very stories of Dilmun, birthing the legend itself? The answer remains elusive, shrouded in the mists of time. What we can assert with confidence is that for the Sumerians, paradise was not an abstract concept, floating ethereally in some inaccessible heaven. It was a tangible place, grounded in reality, with a geographical location they could pinpoint on a map. And that location, according to their beliefs, resided squarely within the Persian Gulf. Now, let's return to Genesis and its quartet of rivers. The text recounts how a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it branched into 4 headstreams: the Pishon, the Gin, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. The Tigris and Euphrates are undeniably clear. Any map readily displays them flowing from the mountains of Turkey southward into the Persian Gulf. But the Pishon and the Gin have been enigmatic puzzles for centuries, their identities lost to time. No known rivers bear these names today. Ancient commentators proposed fanciful identifications, stretching the boundaries of the known world to include the Nile, the Ganges, rivers in remote, far-flung locales. Then, in 1983, a researcher named Juris Sarans offered a different perspective, leveraging the power of satellite imagery. Sarans identified dry riverbeds beneath the sands of Arabia, ghostly vestiges of waterways that seemed to align with the biblical descriptions. One of these ancient courses, now referred to as the Wadi Batin, had once been a mighty river in prehistoric times, coursing from the Hijaz Mountains northeastward towards what is now the Persian Gulf. According to Sarans's compelling theory, this could very well be the biblical Pishon. And the point where all these rivers converged, where the Tigris, the Euphrates, and these now desiccated watercourses met, is today submerged beneath the waters of the Gulf. It's the same region where the Sumerians placed Dilmun, their paradise on earth. Think about the implications of this revelation. 2 distinct traditions, separated by a millennium, describing the same geographical location as the primordial paradise. The Sumerians called it Dilmun. The Hebrews called it Eden. Both situated it in the region of the Persian Gulf. Both associated it with rivers flowing from a central, sacred point. Both depicted it as a place of original fullness, free from death and suffering. A striking coincidence, or perhaps a shared memory echoing through the ages. However, there is another possibility that demands our consideration. that the Hebrews were familiar with Sumerian traditions and adapted them to fit their own worldview. This wouldn't be an isolated occurrence. During the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC, the Jews resided in Mesopotamia, surrounded by temples and libraries brimming with ancient stories. Some scholars believe it was during this period that the Genesis account took its final form, incorporating elements of Mesopotamian tradition but transforming them according to Hebrew theology. But even if this theory holds true, it doesn't entirely resolve the fundamental mystery. Where did the Sumerians get their story of Dilmun? They didn't copy it from anyone. They were the first to write it down. Was it pure invention, a product of their fertile imaginations? Or were they remembering something that existed before the advent of writing, before the ability to record their history in script? As we delve deeper into the ancient texts, the parallels multiply, becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. We're not talking about vague similarities, the kind that could be attributed to universal human imagination. We're talking about specific details, shared narrative structures, elements that are hard to explain as mere coincidence. Consider, for instance, the figure of the woman created from the body of the man. In Genesis, God causes Adam to fall into a deep sleep, takes one of his ribs and fashions Eve from it. The Hebrew word for rib is tsila, although some scholars point out that it can also mean side. In any case, the woman emerges from the body of the man, created from him. Now, listen to what the Sumerian myth of Enki and Ninhursag says. Narrator: when Enki falls ill from eating the forbidden plants, 8 parts of his body ache. Ninhursag creates 8 healing deities, one for each part, and one of these parts is his rib. The name of the goddess created to heal Enki's rib is Ninti. Here's where it gets fascinating. In Sumerian, Ti has 2 meanings, rib and life. Therefore, Ninti can be translated as Lady of the Rib or Lady of Life. And what does Adam call the woman created from his rib? Eve, which in Hebrew is Shava, related to the word for life. Eve means something like the giver of life or mother of all living. So we have a woman associated with both the rib and life in the Sumerian tradition, and a woman created from a rib and called life in the Hebrew tradition. The Sumerian pun, rib and life, seems to have left its mark on the biblical account, even though the words for rib and life are not related in Hebrew. Some scholars see this as evidence of literary dependence. The Hebrews knew the Sumerian tradition and adapted it. Others prefer to speak of a shared cultural background, of ideas circulating throughout the ancient Near East. What is difficult is to maintain that this is an absolute coincidence. But let's move on because the parallels don't end here. Consider now the idea of forbidden knowledge. In Genesis, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil stands at the center of the garden, alongside the tree of life. God forbids humans from eating from it. The serpent tempts Eve, suggesting that eating from the tree will make them like gods, knowing good and evil. Eve eats, offers it to Adam, and the consequence is the loss of paradise. In the Sumerian myth, Enki eats forbidden plants that Ninhursag had grown. The text is explicit. Enki should not have eaten them, but he ate them anyway. The consequence is that he falls ill, cursed by Ninhursag. Only the intervention of other gods, who convince Ninhursag to forgive him, saves Enki from death. In both cases, we have an act of eating something forbidden, a transgression of the order established by the divinity, and severe consequences that threaten the life of the transgressor. The narrative structures are parallel. Now, consider an even more surprising parallel: the relationship between paradise and the temple. We've already seen how the vocabulary of Genesis suggests that Eden was a sacred space, not just a garden. But this connection becomes even more explicit when we compare Eden with later descriptions of the tabernacle and the Temple of Jerusalem. Observe these elements. The entrance to Eden is to the east, guarded by cherubim after the expulsion. The entrance to the tabernacle was to the east. The entrance to Solomon's temple was to the east, and it had cherubim carved on its doors. In Eden, there is a tree of life in the center. In the tabernacle and the temple, the menorah, the 7-branched candlestick, occupied a central place. And scholars have pointed out that the menorah is shaped like a stylized tree, with branches extending from a central trunk. God walks in Eden in the cool of the evening. The presence of God, His glory, dwelt in the tabernacle and filled the temple. From Eden flows a river that divides into 4 headstreams. In Ezekiel's vision of the future temple, a river flows from the sanctuary, growing into a torrent that brings life wherever it goes. Adam must serve and guard Eden. The Levites must serve and guard the sanctuary. The correspondence is systematic. We're not talking about 1 or 2 casual similarities. We're talking about an entire structure that is repeated. Eden is presented as the prototype of the temple, or the temple as an attempt to recreate the lost Eden. This reading isn't new. Ancient rabbis already knew it. The Talmud contains discussions about the relationship between Eden and the sanctuary. But in recent decades, scholars have delved deeper into these connections, showing how deliberate the parallelism seems to be. And this is where the Sumerians re-enter the stage, because the idea that the sanctuary is a recreation of the primordial sacred space is not unique to the Hebrews. It's a concept widely attested in Mesopotamia. Sumerian and Babylonian temples were considered earthly replicas of celestial divine dwellings. They were built according to patterns supposedly revealed by the gods, points of connection between heaven and earth, places where the cosmic order touched the human world. The ziggurat, that stepped pyramid characteristic of Mesopotamian architecture, represented precisely this: an artificial sacred mountain, an attempt to recreate the primordial mountain where the gods dwelt. Ascending the ziggurat was ascending towards the divine. Descending was returning to the world of mortals. And what was Eden but precisely that? A high place from which rivers flow like a mountain, a place where God dwelt and walked, a space of connection between the divine and the human that humans lost and that, through the temple, they tried to recover. The Mesopotamian cultures, the Hebrews, the Persians with their paradisa, walled gardens, all seem to be working with the same conceptual raw material. All imagine a primordial sacred space, a place of original perfection, a point where the boundaries between heaven and earth were permeable. Where does this idea come from? Why did different cultures develop such similar visions of the lost paradise? There are several possible answers, and this night we will explore them all. Perhaps it's a universal psychological archetype, a structure of the human mind that makes us imagine a perfect past as a contrast to the difficulties of the present. Jungian psychologists have argued something like this: that the lost paradise is a symbol of the collective unconscious, an image that arises spontaneously in all cultures because it responds to something deep in the human psyche. Perhaps it's cultural diffusion of ideas that traveled along the trade routes of the ancient Near East. Merchants not only transported goods, they transported stories. A myth told in Ur could reach Haran, from Haran to Canaan, from Canaan to Egypt. Cultural boundaries were more porous than we sometimes imagine. Or perhaps, and this is the most intriguing possibility, everyone is remembering the same thing. A real place, a real time, a real event that affected the ancestors of all these peoples, and that was transmitted generation after generation, eventually crystallizing into myth. A fertile valley where rivers converged. A land of abundance in the midst of the desert. A place that existed when the sea level was lower, a place that the water swallowed thousands of years ago. Dilmun for the Sumerians, Eden for the Hebrews, paradise for the Persians. The same memory filtered through different languages, different cultures, different centuries. But if this were true, if there really was such a place, what evidence could we find today? What do geologists, archaeologists, climate change specialists say? In the next sections, we will look for traces of this lost place. A river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divided and became 4 headstreams. The name of the first is the Pishon. It is the one that winds through the entire land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of that land is good. Aromatic resin and onyx are also there. The name of the second river is the Gin. It is the one that winds through the entire land of Cush. The name of the third river is the Tigris. It runs along the east side of Ashur. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. These words from Genesis have been read millions of times throughout history. They have been meditated upon by rabbis, analyzed by theologians, studied by geographers, and for centuries, they have presented a problem that seemed irresolvable. 2 of the rivers mentioned are perfectly identifiable. The Tigris and the Euphrates flow today as they flowed thousands of years ago, from the mountains of present-day Turkey southward, crossing Iraq and flowing into the Persian Gulf. Any atlas shows them. Any traveler can see them. But the other two rivers, the Pishin and the Gin, simply don't exist. There is no river in the world that bears these names. There is no ancient map that locates them with certainty. For millennia, commentators proposed identifications that ranged from the plausible to the fantastic. Some identified the Gin with the Nile, based on the fact that the text says that it winds through the land of Kush, and Kush sometimes refers to Ethiopia or the region of the Upper Nile. Others proposed rivers in India, in Persia, even in places as remote as the European Danube. The dispersion of theories reflected the perplexity of the scholars. The Pishin was even more mysterious. The text says that it winds through the land of Havilah, where there is gold, aromatic resin, and onyx. Havilah appears in other biblical passages, but its location is never clearly specified. Some placed it in Arabia, others in Africa, others in regions as far away as India. The difficulty was so great that many commentators simply gave up the effort to locate these rivers. They concluded that the Pishin and the Gin were symbolic names, literary inventions, or that they referred to rivers that had existed before the flood, but that it had erased them from the face of the earth. And so the matter remained for centuries, until the arrival of satellites. In the 1980s, images taken from space began to reveal something that human eyes limited to the surface could not see. Beneath the sands of the Arabian desert, beneath layers of sediments accumulated over millennia, existed ancient riverbeds, rivers that had stopped flowing so long ago that no living human remembered them, but whose traces were still there, waiting to be discovered. The researcher Juris Sarins of Missouri State University was one of the first to connect these discoveries with the biblical text. Using images from the Landsat satellite, Sarins identified a system of dry riverbeds that crossed Arabia from west to east. The most significant of these courses is known today as Wadi al-Batin, although it has different names in different sections of its route. The Wadi al-Batin begins in the Hijaz Mountains in western Arabia and extends northeastward for hundreds of kilometers until it reaches what is now the border between Kuwait and Iraq. In prehistoric times, when the climate of Arabia was much wetter than today, this course carried water permanently. It was a real river with tributaries, with tributary valleys, with all the hydrological infrastructure of an active fluvial system. Sarins proposed that this could be the biblical Pishin. The identification wasn't arbitrary. The text of Genesis says that the Pishin winds through the land of Havilah, where there is gold. And it turns out that the Hijaz region, where the Wadi al-Batin originates, is indeed a gold-bearing area. The gold of Arabia was known in antiquity. The mines of Ma'ad Adh Dahab, whose name literally means cradle of gold, have been exploited for thousands of years. In addition, the region also contains aromatic resin and various semi-precious stones. All the elements that Genesis mentions in relation to the Pishin are present in this region of Arabia. But there is more. Satellite images revealed that the Wadi al-Batin didn't simply end in the desert. Its course became increasingly diffuse towards the northeast, towards a region that is now covered by the waters of the Persian Gulf. In prehistoric times, when sea levels were lower, the Wadi al-Batin would have reached an area of confluence where the Tigris and the Euphrates also flowed, a point where four rivers converged, exactly as Genesis describes, although the text presents it in reverse. A river that comes out and divides into four, as if the observer were at the central point looking outward. And again, here, the identifications are less certain, but there is no shortage of candidates. Some researchers have proposed that it could be the Karun, a river that rises in the Zagros Mountains of Iran and flows southwest to flow into the Shat al-Arab, the joint estuary of the Tigris and the Euphrates. Others suggest now dry courses similar to the Wadi al-Batin, but on the Iranian side of the Gulf. What is significant is that all these rivers, the known and the proposed, converge in the same general region, the northern end of the Persian Gulf, the same place where the Sumerians located Dilmun. Now, we have to be careful here. The identification of ancient rivers by satellite images is a developing science, and Sarins' conclusions have not been universally accepted. Other researchers have proposed different identifications, and some argue that the biblical rivers cannot be located with any geographical certainty. But what we can affirm with certainty is the following. Between 10,000 and 15,000 years ago, the climate of the Arabian Peninsula was radically different from today. What is now desert was then savanna. There were lakes, permanent rivers, abundant vegetation. The geological and paleoclimatic evidence is incontrovertible, and the Persian Gulf did not exist. This is important, so let's stop for a moment to understand it well. The Persian Gulf is a shallow basin. Its average depth is only 50 meters, and in many areas it is considerably less. During the last ice age, when large amounts of water were trapped in the polar ice caps, sea level was approximately 120 meters. This means that the Persian Gulf was completely dry. It was dry land, an extensive valley through which flowed the rivers that came down from the surrounding mountains. The Tigris, the Euphrates, the Karun, and those courses now buried under Arabia. Imagine that landscape. A green valley in the middle of a region that was beginning to desertify. Rivers that brought fresh water from the mountains. Springs that bubbled up from the ground fed by underground aquifers. Palm trees, reeds, wild animals that came to drink, and almost certainly human communities that settled there, taking advantage of the abundance of resources. For these communities, the Gulf Valley would have been genuinely paradisiacal. An oasis of life in a world that was becoming increasingly arid around them. A special, memorable place, worthy of being remembered. And then the water rose. Gradually, over thousands of years, the glaciers melted. Sea level increased. The valley began to flood. First from the south, where the Indian Ocean connected with the basin, then moving north, swallowing the lowlands, covering the settlements, submerging the places where humans had lived for generations. It wasn't a sudden catastrophe. There was no instant flood that drowned everyone. It was a slow, generational process. The inhabitants would have noticed that the sea was approaching every year, that the lands of their parents were underwater, that they had to move higher and higher, towards the north, towards the highlands. But in the collective memory, over many generations of oral transmission, that gradual process may have been compressed, simplified, and mythologized. Slow loss became expulsion. The advance of the sea became divine punishment. The lost paradise became the garden from which we were cast out. It's a hypothesis. We cannot prove it with absolute certainty, but it has the merit of explaining something that is otherwise strange. Why do so many cultures of the ancient Near East have stories of a lost paradise located in the same general geographic region? The Sumerians remembered Dilmun in the Gulf. The Hebrews described Eden with rivers that converge in the Gulf. The Babylonians told stories of a garden of the gods in that same direction. Coincidence or memory? The next time you look at a map of the Persian Gulf, think about what is beneath those blue waters. Ancient riverbeds, perhaps the remains of human settlements, perhaps the vestiges of a world that existed before the sea reclaimed it, a world that we still remember, even if we no longer know that we are remembering it. The sea holds secrets. This is not a poetic metaphor, but an archaeological reality. Every time the level of the oceans rises, every time the waters cover lands that were previously exposed, an archive of the human past is sealed. And for most of history, that archive has remained inaccessible. But in recent decades, technology has begun to change that. Studies of the bottom of the Persian Gulf have revealed a submerged landscape that tells a fascinating story. Through sonar sediment analysis and, in some cases, direct dives, researchers have mapped what lies beneath the shallow waters of the Gulf. What they found confirms what geology already suggested. This was once solid ground, inhabited, teeming with life. Geoffrey Rose, an archaeologist at the University of Birmingham, has dedicated years to studying this submerged region. In an influential 2010 paper, Rose argued that the Persian Gulf Valley was a crucial refuge for human populations during the most arid periods of the late Pleistocene. While the rest of Arabia transformed into an uninhabitable desert, this valley, nourished by rivers and springs, would have sustained significant human communities. Rose christened it the Gulf Oasis. The evidence supporting this theory is indirect, yet compelling. Along the present-day coasts of the Gulf, on both the Arabian and Iranian sides, numerous archaeological sites dating from the period immediately following the inundation exist. These sites showcase a sophisticated material culture that seems to have appeared suddenly, without clear antecedents in the region. Where did these people come from? The most parsimonious answer is that they came from the now submerged valley. As the waters rose, they migrated towards the coasts, carrying with them their traditions, their techniques, their stories. And one of those stories might have been the memory of a lost paradise. Now, let's be precise about the timescales involved. The Persian Gulf began to flood approximately 14,000 years ago, as the last ice age ended and sea levels began to rise. However, the inundation wasn't instantaneous. It was a process that took millennia. 10,000 years ago, the Gulf was still considerably smaller than it is today. 8,000 years ago, it had reached approximately its current extent. 6,000 years ago, conditions were similar to those of today. The earliest Sumerian texts that mention Dilmun date back to around 2100 BC, roughly 4,000 years ago. By then, the Gulf had been in its present state for several millennia. Could a memory have survived that long? The answer is probably not as a direct memory, but certainly as a tradition. Oral traditions have an astounding capacity to preserve information over extended periods, although that information undergoes transformation in the process. Specific details are lost or distorted, yet the basic structure of the story can endure for many generations. The Australian Aborigines, for example, have oral traditions that appear to preserve memories of changes in the coastline that occurred more than 10,000 years ago. So it's conceivable, although not demonstrable, that the Sumerian stories about Dilmun preserved some echo of an earlier time, when that region was different, when there existed a place that the water later covered. But there's another possibility we must consider. Perhaps the Sumerians weren't remembering the submerged valley at all. Perhaps they were talking about something that still existed in their time, the islands of Bahrain. As mentioned earlier, Bahrain has been identified by archaeologists as the historical Dilmun. Excavations have revealed a flourishing civilization that existed simultaneously with Sumeria, maintaining active trade relations. Sumerian ships sailed to Dilmun to obtain copper, precious stones, and other goods. Dilmun was real, tangible, visitable. Yet, Dilmun also possessed those extraordinary characteristics that made it seem special. The freshwater springs that bubbled even beneath the sea, the strategic position on trade routes, the relative fertility amidst an arid region. Perhaps the Sumerians projected mythical qualities onto historical Dilmun because the place already possessed a certain wonder. Or perhaps the older stories about a primordial paradise merged with the knowledge of this real island, creating a Dilmun that was simultaneously historical and mythical. The two possibilities are not mutually exclusive. Myth and geography can overlap, reinforce each other, creating a place that is both real and imagined. What we can state with some certainty is that the geography of Genesis aligns remarkably well with this region. A place where rivers flowing from different directions converge, a place associated with waters that spring from the earth, a place east of Mesopotamia towards the rising sun, and a place that, according to some researchers, is now partially underwater. In 2017, a team of archaeologists led by researchers from Uppsala University announced the discovery of submerged structures off the coast of Kuwait. Using side-scan sonar, they identified what appeared to be remnants of human constructions at depths of between 5 and 15 meters. Initial analysis suggested these structures might date back to the 5th or 6th millennium BC. That is, to the period when sea levels were still rising. The finding was controversial, and its interpretation remains debated. Some argue that the structures are natural, not artificial. Others maintain they are evidence of submerged human settlements. What no one disputes is that the region deserves further investigation. The problem is that underwater archaeology in the Persian Gulf is extraordinarily difficult. The waters are murky, the currents are strong, and the political conditions of the region don't always facilitate international research. Much of the Gulf floor remains unexplored. But imagine what we might find if we could excavate beneath those waters with the same meticulousness that we excavate on land. Imagine the settlements, the artifacts, the stories that might emerge. Perhaps someday we'll find direct evidence of the communities that lived in the valley before the inundation. Perhaps we'll find their tools, their dwellings, the remnants of their material culture. Perhaps we'll find confirmation that this was indeed a special place, a refuge of life amidst growing aridity. Or perhaps we'll find nothing, Perhaps the waters and time have erased all physical traces. But even if the archaeological record remains empty, the ancient texts will continue to speak. The Sumerians will continue to tell stories of Dilmun. The Hebrews will continue to remember Eden with its 4 rivers. And we will continue to wonder what truth lies within those stories, because there's something in the persistence of myth that resists purely rational explanation, something that suggests that behind the words lies a real experience, even if that experience has been transformed by the passage of time beyond recognition. A green valley, rivers converging, abundance amidst scarcity, and then the loss, the water rising, the expulsion to less generous lands. Paradise existed and paradise was lost. In the libraries of Nineveh, buried beneath centuries of rubble, lay a story that would change our understanding of the ancient past. When British archaeologists unearthed the clay tablets from the palace of King Ashurbanipal in the 19th century, they didn't know they were recovering the oldest known epic poem in humanity, the Epic of Gilgamesh. This text, originally composed in Sumerian and later translated and expanded in Akkadian, tells the story of a king who ruled the city of Uruk approximately 4,700 years ago. Gilgamesh, according to legend, was 2/3 god and 1/3 human. He possessed superhuman strength, incomparable beauty, and an appetite for life that no feat could satiate, but he was also terrified of death. The epic narrates how Gilgamesh, after losing his dearest friend Enkidu, becomes obsessed with finding immortality. He cannot accept that a being as glorious as he must end in dust. So he embarks on a journey that no mortal has completed before, to seek out Utnapishtim, the only human who managed to escape death. And who was Utnapishtim? He was the Sumerian Noah, the man who, warned by the gods of an impending flood, built a boat, saved his family and the animals, and survived while the rest of humanity perished. As a reward for his obedience, the gods granted him eternal life and sent him to live in a special place, beyond the confines of the mortal world, a paradise, a place where death could not reach him. Gilgamesh journeys towards this place, and his journey takes him through landscapes that mix real geography with cosmic geography. He crosses mountains whose peaks touch the sky and whose roots descend into the underworld. He traverses a tunnel of absolute darkness. Finally, he arrives at a garden by the sea, a place of supernatural beauty. The text describes this garden with extraordinary images. The trees bear fruits of carnelian and lapis lazuli. Their branches are laden with precious stones. It is a place of abundance, but an abundance that is crystallized, mineralized, transformed into something eternal and immutable. This garden of the gods, as it's sometimes called, represents a liminal space, a threshold between the world of mortals and the realm of immortality. And beyond this garden, crossing the waters of death, is the place where Utnapishtim dwells forever. The parallels with the biblical Eden are evident but not exact. Both are places of primordial perfection. Both are associated with special trees. Both are inaccessible to ordinary mortals. But while Eden was the original home of humanity from which we were expelled, the Garden of Gilgamesh is a destination, a place the hero tries to reach. However, there's a deeper connection that deserves attention. In both traditions, paradise is associated with lost immortality. Adam and Eve could have eaten from the tree of life and lived forever, but sin closed that path to them. Gilgamesh desperately seeks to recover the immortality that mortals lost, but he fails. The story of Gilgamesh and Utnapishtim contains a particularly revealing episode. When the hero finally finds the immortal and begs him for the secret of eternal life, Utnapishtim tells him that at the bottom of the sea there exists a plant that can rejuvenate whoever eats it. It's called The Old Man Becomes Young. Gilgamesh ties stones to his feet, plunges into the deep waters, and finds the plant. For a moment, he holds in his hands the key to immortality. But when he stops to rest by a well of fresh water, a snake smells the fragrance of the plant, steals it, and eats it. The snake sheds its skin and rejuvenates itself. Gilgamesh loses his chance forever. Does the snake that deprives humanity of immortality sound familiar? The parallel with Genesis is structural rather than literal. In both cases, a snake is involved in the loss of eternal life. In both cases, the human being has potential access to immortality but loses it. In both cases, the loss is irreversible. We're not suggesting that one text copied directly from the other. The relationship is more complex. Both traditions seem to be working with a common set of images and concerns. Paradise, immortality, the snake, the loss. They are variations on the same theme, different interpretations of the same fundamental angst. And that angst is profoundly human. Why do we die? Why can't we live forever? Was there ever a time when death didn't exist? Can we recover what we lost? Gilgamesh asks these questions. Genesis offers its own answers. The fact that cultures separated by centuries formulated the same questions suggests that we're facing something universal, something that touches the deepest fibers of the human experience. But let's return to geography. Where was the paradise of Utnapishtim? The text doesn't give precise coordinates, but it offers clues. It's beyond the waters of death, an ocean that mortals cannot normally cross. It's in the direction where the sun rises, towards the east. It's associated with a garden by the sea. These descriptions are consistent with the general location we've been exploring. The region of the Persian Gulf, east of Mesopotamia, where the sea meets the land. The same place where the Sumerians located Dilmun. The same place that Genesis seems to describe with its 4 rivers. Again and again, the Mesopotamian texts point in the same direction, towards the east, towards the water, towards a place that was or that became inaccessible. There's another detail from the Epic of Gilgamesh that deserves mention. When the hero finally returns to Uruk, defeated and without the immortality he sought, the text describes him contemplating the walls of his city. He gazes at the fortifications he himself built, the temple of Ishtar, the plazas, and the gardens. And in that contemplation, he finds something akin to peace. Literal immortality was denied to him, but his works will endure. The city he built will be his monument. The story he starred in will be told for millennia until today, until this night when you are hearing it. Gilgamesh couldn't return to paradise, but he found another way to transcend death, through memory. Perhaps this is also part of the deeper meaning of the stories of Lost Paradise. We not only lament what we lost, we also seek ways to recover it, to recreate it, to keep it alive, even if only in words. The Sumerians built ziggurats, which imitated the sacred mountain. The Hebrews built the temple as a replica of Eden. Gilgamesh built walls that bear his name. And we tell the stories. Among the manuscripts found in the caves of Qumran, by the Dead Sea, were copies of a text that Jewish tradition had preserved only in fragments. The first readers of these scrolls in the 1940s discovered that they held versions of the Book of Enoch, far more complete than what was known until then. The Book of Enoch is one of the pseudepigrapha, a collection of writings attributed to biblical figures from the period of ancient Judaism. It wasn't included in the Hebrew canon nor in most Christian Bibles, although the Ethiopian Church considers it sacred and has preserved it complete for centuries. It's composed of various sections written in different periods, probably between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century AD, and contains descriptions of paradise that complement and sometimes contradict what we read in Genesis. Enoch, according to the Hebrew Bible, was the 7th patriarch from Adam. Genesis dedicates only a few lines to him, but extraordinary lines. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. He didn't die like the other patriarchs. He simply ceased to be here. The Book of Enoch elaborates on this figure. It presents Enoch as a visionary who traveled through the heavens, who visited the ends of the earth, who saw the places where the angels dwell and the abysses where the demons are punished. And among all these travels, Enoch visits the Garden of Righteousness, where the tree of life grows. The description it offers is both familiar and strange. Enoch recounts that he was taken to a mountain whose summit reached to the sky. There he saw 7 mountains of precious stones arranged in such a way that 3 were towards the east and 3 towards the north, with a central mountain higher than the others. This central mountain was crowned by a tree of incomparable fragrance, a tree whose aroma was sweeter than any known perfume. The angel who accompanied Enoch explained to him that this tree is reserved for the righteous and the humble. When the great judgment arrives, its fruit will be given as food to the chosen ones. Its fragrance will penetrate their bones, and they will live a long life on earth as your ancestors lived. You recognize the elements. A sacred mountain, a special tree on its summit, restricted access reserved only for the worthy, the promise of long or eternal life. But there are important differences with Genesis. In Genesis, the tree of life is in the center of the garden, accessible in principle until sin forbids it. In Enoch, the tree is on a remote mountain, guarded, waiting for a future time to be revealed. Genesis looks back towards a lost paradise. Enoch looks forward towards a paradise to be recovered. This difference in perspective is significant. The Book of Enoch was written in a period of intense apocalyptic expectation, when many Jews believed that the end of the present world and the beginning of a new era were near. Paradise was not just a memory, it was a promise. The lost garden would be restored. But beyond the theological differences, what interests us tonight is the cosmic geography that Enoch describes. The text places the Garden of Righteousness at the end of the earth, towards the east. Enoch travels in that direction, crossing deserts and mountains until he arrives at a place where the earth meets the sky. It's a geography that mixes the physical with the metaphysical, the real with the visionary. And yet, even in its visionary character, certain geographical elements resonate with what we've been exploring. The east as the direction of paradise, the mountains as the dwelling place of the divine, the water as an element associated with life and renewal. In another section of the book, Enoch describes a journey towards the north, where he sees the mouths of all the rivers of the earth and the mouth of the abyss. This image of the abyss from which the waters flow recalls the Sumerian concept of the Apsu, the subterranean ocean of fresh water. It also recalls the description in Genesis, where a river flows from Eden to divide into four. The traditions intertwine. The Sumerians speak of Enki in the Apsu, from where the fresh waters spring. Genesis speaks of a river that flows from Eden. Enoch speaks of the abyss. They are different images of the same idea, that there exists a primordial place from which all the water of life flows. The Book of Enoch also contains the story of the Watchers, angels who descended to earth, united with human women, and engendered a race of giants. This story, barely mentioned in Genesis, is developed extensively in Enoch and has notable parallels with Mesopotamian traditions about semi-divine beings that existed in primordial times. What's relevant to our theme is that, according to Enoch, the sin of the Watchers was one of the causes of the corruption of the world that led to the flood. And the flood, as we've seen, is the event that separates the primordial era from the current era, the time of paradise from the time of exile. In the tradition of Enoch, paradise wasn't lost by the sin of Adam alone. It was lost by a cosmic catastrophe that involved multiple transgressions. That of the first humans, that of the rebel angels, that of humanity as a whole, which became corrupted to the point of deserving destruction. This more complex vision of the loss of paradise contrasts with the simpler narrative of Genesis, but both share a fundamental element. Something broke. Something that was right ceased to be so. An access that existed was closed. And in both cases, hope remains. Genesis promises that the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. Enoch promises that the righteous will eat from the tree of life when the time of judgment arrives. Paradise was lost, but not forever. There's another element of the Book of Enoch that deserves attention. Its description of Sheol, the underworld, and the place of punishment for the wicked. Enoch visits these places as well, and his descriptions profoundly influenced later conceptions of heaven and hell, both in late Judaism and in Christianity. What's fascinating is how the cosmos of Enoch is structured vertically. Above is heaven with its multiple levels. In the middle is earth. Below is Sheol. And at the ends of the earth, towards the east, is the garden reserved for the righteous. This cosmic structure isn't exclusive to Enoch. We find it also in Mesopotamian, Persian, even Greek traditions, the cosmos as a series of levels with paradise on high or at the ends and the underworld below. It's a symbolic geography shared by multiple ancient cultures. And in the center of this geography is always the tree of life, the tree of knowledge, the tree whose fragrance reaches the sky, the tree that connects all the levels of the cosmos with its roots in the abyss and its branches in the stars. The world tree, the Axis Mundi, an image that appears in Sumeria, in Israel, in Persia, in India, in Scandinavia. Everywhere humans have looked up and wondered how Earth connects with the heavens. There are moments in historical research when scattered pieces of a puzzle begin to click into place. Details that seemed disconnected reveal an underlying pattern. What was once confusing becomes clear. Tonight, we have arrived at one of those moments because everything we have explored so far, the Sumerian traditions, the rivers of Genesis, the visions of Enoch, the journeys of Gilgamesh, converges into a revelation that transforms our understanding of Eden. And that revelation is architectural. It fundamentally changes how we envision that sacred space. The Garden of Eden wasn't a garden. It was a temple. To understand this, we need first to comprehend what a temple signified to the peoples of the ancient Near East. It wasn't simply a building where religious ceremonies were performed. It was much more than that. The temple was the point of contact between heaven and earth. It was the place where the divine chose to dwell among humans. It was literally the house of God. Imagine the awe and reverence such a place would inspire. The Mesopotamians constructed their temples atop ziggurats, those stepped pyramids that dominated the landscape of their cities. But why on high? Because the temple was meant to approach the heavens as closely as humanly possible. The ziggurat was an artificial mountain, a recreation of the primordial cosmic mountain where the gods resided. Think of it as a physical embodiment of their spiritual aspirations, a bridge between the mundane and the divine. The Egyptians oriented their temples according to precise celestial axes, aligning them with the stars and the movements of the sun. The temple was a microcosm, a miniature replica of the cosmic order. What happened inside the temple reflected and affected what happened in the entire universe. It was a place of immense power and consequence. The Hebrews inherited this worldview. Their tabernacle, the sacred tent that accompanied Israel during the Exodus, and subsequently the Temple of Jerusalem were conceived as dwellings of the divine presence. The glory of God, the Kabod, dwelt in the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctum of the sanctuary. Picture the scene. A portable temple, a tangible connection to the divine, traveling with them through the wilderness. Now, observe the correspondences between Eden and the temple. They aren't vague resemblances. They are systematic, point-by-point parallels that suggest a deliberate relationship. The entrance to Eden was to the east. After the expulsion, cherubim with flaming swords guarded that eastern entrance. Now consider the tabernacle. Its entrance was to the east. The Temple of Solomon? Its entrance was to the east. And in both cases there were cherubim. The cherubim embroidered on the veil of the tabernacle, the cherubim carved into the doors of the temple, the cherubim of gold that covered the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies. These were not the chubby, winged babies of Renaissance art. In the iconography of the ancient Near East, cherubim were hybrid beings, creatures with the bodies of lions or bulls, the wings of eagles, and human faces. They were guardians of sacred spaces. Envision monumental statues of these beings flanking the entrances of Assyrian palaces. Their function was to protect the place where the divinity dwelt. Their presence in Eden indicates that we are facing a sacred space of the highest order. This isn't just a pleasant garden. It's a protected sanctuary. Now consider the trees. In the center of Eden were two special trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What was in the center of the tabernacle and the temple? The menorah, the seven-branched candelabrum. Scholars have long noted that the menorah is shaped like a stylized tree. Its branches extend from a central trunk like the branches of an almond tree. In fact, the text of Exodus specifies that the menorah must have cups in the shape of almond blossoms. It is a tree of light, a tree that never dies because its flames are constantly renewed. The menorah was the tree of life of the tabernacle, a symbolic representation of the primordial tree that grew in Eden. And then there is the water. From Eden flowed a river that divided into 4 branches, bringing life to all directions. In the prophetic visions of the future temple, we find the same image. Ezekiel, in chapter 47 of his book, describes water flowing from the threshold of the temple eastward. The water begins as a trickle but grows to become a mighty river. Wherever this river flows, it brings life. Trees grow on its banks, fish abound in its waters. The salty becomes sweet. It is Eden restored, paradise recreated in the form of an eschatological temple. The image is potent. water as a source of life, flowing from the very heart of the sanctuary. But perhaps the most revealing parallel is linguistic. We mentioned it before, but it deserves more detailed examination. When Genesis describes Adam's function in Eden, it uses two Hebrew verbs, abad and shamar. Traditional translations render them as to till and to keep, or to cultivate and to guard. They seem like agricultural verbs appropriate for a gardener. But these same verbs, exactly the same combination, appear in another very specific context. In the book of Numbers, chapter 3, verses 7 and 8, the functions of the Levites in the tabernacle are described: to benabad and to shamar the sanctuary, to serve and to guard. The coincidence cannot be casual. Biblical Hebrew has an extensive vocabulary, and the sacred authors chose their words with theological care. To use the same verbs for Adam in Eden and for the Levites in the tabernacle is a deliberate signal. The author wants us to understand something profound. Adam was not a gardener. He was a priest. His function was not to cultivate plants. It was to serve in the sanctuary and to guard it. Dr. Michael Heiser, in his work The Unseen Realm, extensively develops this interpretation. He argues that ancient readers of Genesis, familiar with the vocabulary of worship and the architecture of the tabernacle, would have immediately recognized the connections. For them, Eden was not a tale about agriculture. It was a tale about priesthood, about the original function of the human being as a mediator between God and creation. This understanding unlocks new layers of meaning in the text. This reading resolves several perplexities of the text. Why does God walk in Eden in the cool of the evening? Because Eden is his dwelling place, the place where he has chosen to inhabit. The same terminology is used to describe the presence of God in the tabernacle. God walks in the midst of the camp of Israel. Why does the sin of Adam and Eve result in permanent expulsion? Because they have introduced impurity into the sanctuary. The impure cannot coexist with the holy. All the subsequent legislation of Leviticus on purity and impurity has its roots here. The sanctity of the space where God dwells cannot be contaminated. Why is the way back blocked by cherubim with fiery swords? Because access to the Holy of Holies is restricted. Only the high priest could enter, and only once a year on the Day of Atonement. Eden as a primordial sanctuary has the same restrictions but absolute. The expulsion from Eden is not the banishment from an orchard. It is the loss of access to the divine presence. It is the separation between God and humanity that all of subsequent biblical history will attempt to remedy. This is the very core of the Old Testament narrative. And here we arrive at something profound. If Eden was the primordial temple, then the tabernacle and the Temple of Jerusalem were attempts to recreate Eden. They were copies of the original, replicas of the lost sanctuary. This explains why the construction of the tabernacle is described with so much detail in the book of Exodus. It is not an excess of bureaucratic zeal. It is that every element matters. Every measure, every material, every color has significance. Because the tabernacle is a recreation of the primordial space where God and humanity coexisted. The Ark of the Covenant occupied the place of the Tree of Knowledge. It contained the law, the distinction between good and evil. The menorah occupied the place of the Tree of Life. The veil with embroidered cherubim reproduced the barrier guarded by cherubim. The orientation toward the east replicated the entrance to Eden. The Levite priests, with their special garments, their purification rituals, their functions of service and guardianship, were doing what Adam should have done. They were fulfilling the original priestly vocation of humanity. But the tabernacle and the temple were only approximations, imperfect copies. Full access to the divine presence remained restricted. The veil continued to separate. The cherubim continued to guard. The hope was that one day the veil would be torn, that the way to the Tree of Life would be opened again, that Eden would be restored not as a physical space but as a spiritual reality. This hope permeated Israelite culture for centuries. The Hebrew prophets glimpsed that day. Ezekiel described the future temple with the river of life flowing from its interior. Isaiah spoke of a time when the earth would be filled with the knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea. The book of Revelation, at the end of the New Testament, describes the New Jerusalem descending from heaven, and in its center, the tree of life bearing fruit each month with leaves that are for the healing of the nations. The end joins with the beginning. The lost Eden becomes the restored Eden. But for that to happen, something has to change. Someone has to do what Adam did not do. Someone has to fulfill the priestly vocation that humanity abandoned. That is another story for another night. Perhaps what matters to us now is this: Eden was never a botanical garden. It was the first temple, the original sanctuary, the place where heaven touched earth. And all the stories we have explored tonight, Dilmun, Gilgamesh, Enoch, the 4 rivers, the mountains of precious stones, converge on this same idea: a primordial sacred place, a space of connection between the divine and the human, a paradise that was lost but that memory preserves. Let us pause for a moment on the figure of Adam. His name in Hebrew, Adam, is related to the word Adamah, which means earth or soil, the man made of earth, the earthly one. But this etymology, far from reducing him to simple animated clay, contains a theological paradox. Because Adam is earth, yes, but earth into which God breathed his own breath. He is dust, but dust that walks with God in the cool of the evening. He is a creature, but a creature who names the animals, exercising a prerogative that in other cultures was reserved for the gods. The tension between the earthly and the divine is inscribed in the human being from the beginning, and nowhere is it more evident than in the vocation that is assigned to him. Let us return to the verbs abad and shamar, to serve and to guard. The verb abad has a broad semantic field. It can mean to work in the general sense of performing a task, but its most frequent use in the Hebrew Bible is cultic. The Levites abdin in the tabernacle. The Israelites must abad God, serve him, worship him. When Pharaoh demands that the Hebrews not go into the desert to offer sacrifices, he uses this verb. He does not want them to abad their God. The verb shamar is equally rich. It means to guard, to keep, to watch over, but also to observe in the sense of complying. The Israelites must shamar the commandments. The Levites must shamar the tabernacle, guarding it against any profanation. The same word describes the cherubim who guard the way to the tree of life. When these 2 verbs appear together, they form a technical expression. It is not accidental that they appear in Genesis to describe Adam's function, and then reappear in Numbers to describe the function of the Levites. It is a specific, priestly vocabulary that deliberately connects both texts. Some scholars have gone further. They have pointed out that the creation account in Genesis 1 has a liturgical structure. The 6 days of creation, followed by a day of rest, reflect the pattern of the Israelite week that culminates in the Sabbath. The cosmos is presented as a temple that God builds and in which he then rests. In this reading, creation is not just an act of power. It is an act of consecration. God is building his cosmic sanctuary, and the 7th day when he rests is taking possession of it like a king who sits on his throne after building his palace. And the human being, created in the image of God, has a specific function in this cosmic sanctuary. He is the priest, the mediator, the one who serves and guards. This interpretation has support in the vocabulary of the divine image. When the text says that God created man in his image and likeness, it is using language that in the ancient Near East was applied to kings. The Egyptian pharaohs were considered images of the gods, divine representatives on earth. The statues of the gods in Mesopotamian temples were called images, material presences of the divinity. Genesis democratizes this concept. Not only the king is the image of God, every human being is. Each person carries within himself the representation of the divine on earth. But being the image of God carries responsibility. The image does not exist for itself. It exists to represent. The human being exists to make God present in creation, to extend the divine order over chaos, to serve and guard the cosmic sanctuary. This is the context in which we must understand the tragedy of sin. It is not simply a disobedience. It is an abdication. Adam and Eve abandoned their priestly vocation. Instead of serving God, they serve themselves. Instead of guarding the sanctuary, they allow disorder to enter. The serpent, in many traditions of the ancient Near East, was associated with primordial chaos. The chaotic waters that existed before creation were represented as dragons or sea serpents. Tiamat in Babylon, Leviathan in Hebrew texts. The serpent of Eden, whatever it is exactly, represents the intrusion of disorder into the ordered space of the sanctuary. And the guardians of the sanctuary, Adam and Eve, instead of expelling the intruder, listened to his voice, failing in their function of shamar. The result is that they themselves are expelled. There is a tragic irony here. Adam was placed in Eden to guard it. He ends up being guarded outside of it, blocked by cherubim who do the work that he should have done. The subsequent history of Israel can be read as the attempt to restore what was lost. Abraham is called to be a blessing to all nations, a mediating function. The people of Israel are constituted as a kingdom of priests, a community whose vocation is priestly. The Levites are set apart to serve and guard the tabernacle, explicitly resuming the Edenic function. But there is always a veil in between, there is always a separation. The high priest can enter the Holy of Holies only once a year and with blood of atonement. The full presence of God remains inaccessible. The problem is not only that Eden was lost geographically. The problem is that humanity incapacitated itself to inhabit it. The impurity introduced by sin makes coexistence with divine holiness impossible. This explains why the laws of purity in Leviticus are so elaborate, so meticulous, so apparently obsessive. They are not ritual whims. They are the attempt to create the conditions for the divine presence to dwell in the midst of the people. Each regulation on the pure and the impure aims to protect the sacred space, keeping it habitable for God. And yet, the prophets recognized that this was not enough. The problem was in the human heart, not only in external actions. Jeremiah spoke of a new covenant written on the heart. Ezekiel promised a new heart and a new spirit. The transformation would have to be internal, not only ritual. But let us return to Adam, to the first priest, to the guardian who did not guard. There is another detail of the text that takes on new meaning in this reading. When God confronts Adam after the sin, he asks him, "Where are you?" The question is not geographic. God knows perfectly well where Adam is physically. The question is existential, vocational. Where are you in relation to me? Where are you in relation to your function? Adam has hidden himself, covered himself with fig leaves, abandoned his post. The same question resonates throughout human history. Where are you? Are you fulfilling your vocation as a divine image? Are you serving and guarding? Or have you hidden yourself, covered in shame, turned away from the presence that gave you life? Eden as a temple reminds us that human existence has an inescapable priestly dimension. We are not simply evolved animals seeking to survive and reproduce. We are creatures called to mediate between heaven and earth, to make the divine present in the material, to extend the order and beauty of the sanctuary to all of creation. This vocation was lost, but not forgotten. The Sumerians remembered a time of communion with the gods. The Hebrews longed for the restoration of Eden. The mystics of all traditions have sought to recover access to the sacred. Perhaps the myth of Paradise Lost is not just nostalgia for a better past. Perhaps it is the echo of a vocation that we carry inscribed in the depths of our being, the intuition that we were made for something more, the suspicion that there is a garden, a temple, a meeting place waiting for us somewhere toward the east. At the heart of almost all ancient cosmologies there exists a mountain, not an ordinary mountain, but a mountain that is more than a mountain, an axis that traverses the levels of the cosmos, connecting the underworld with the earth and the earth with the sky. Scholars call it the cosmic mountain or, using the Latin term, the axis mundi. For the Sumerians, this mountain was the place where the god of the sky, and Ki, the goddess of the earth, had united in the beginning of time. From that union was born Enlil, the god of the air, who separated his parents and created the space where life would be possible. The primordial mountain was the point of origin, the navel of the world. The Mesopotamian ziggurats were recreations of this cosmic mountain. Each important city had its own Uruk, Babylon, Nippur. These stepped pyramids rose above the alluvial plain, visible from miles around. On their summits were temples where priests performed rituals and where, according to belief, the gods descended to meet with humans. The name of the ziggurat of Babylon has come down to us through the Bible. Babel, the famous tower that humans attempted to build to the sky. The biblical account presents this as an act of pride punished by God. But from the Babylonian perspective, the ziggurat was an act of piety, building a staircase so that the gods could comfortably descend to earth. What interests us is the underlying idea that there exists a point of connection between the levels of the cosmos and that humans yearn to access it. Eden participates in this same cosmic geography. The text of Genesis presents it as an elevated place from which rivers flow in all directions. Water cannot flow upward. If it comes out of Eden and divides into 4 branches, Eden must be in a high place, an elevated source. This imagery underscores the unique and privileged nature of Eden. This image of the mountain as the source of rivers is universal. Mount Meru in Hindu and Buddhist cosmology is in the center of the universe, and from it are born the great rivers that fertilize the earth. Mount Kaf in Islamic tradition surrounds the world and is the source of all springs. Even in traditions as distant as China, sacred mountains like Kunlun are described as sources of celestial rivers. Why this association between mountains and water? Probably has an observational origin. In arid regions, rivers effectively originate in the mountains, where snow melts or where rains are more abundant. The mountains are the water reservoirs that give life to the plains. It is natural that they were seen as sacred, as sources of blessing. But the symbolism goes deeper. Mountains, because of their height, seem to touch the sky. They are closer to the gods, to the clouds, to the stars. To climb a mountain is to ascend toward the divine. To descend is to return to the ordinary world. Moses receives the law on Mount Sinai. Elijah hears the voice of God on Mount Horeb. The Temple of Jerusalem is built on Mount Zion. Jesus is transfigured on a mountain, is crucified on another, ascends from the Olive Mount. The mountains punctuate moments of divine revelation. The prophet Ezekiel, in his vision of the future temple, places it on a very high mountain. He doesn't specify which mountain, but the elevation is significant. The eschatological temple will be at the highest point, in the center of the restored world, with the river of life flowing from within. And the psalmist sings, "I will lift up my eyes to the mountains. From whence comes my help? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth." The mountain is the place from whence help comes, because the mountain is the place where God dwells. Now, let's connect this with what we know of Dilmun. Sumerian texts describe Dilmun with language that mixes the geographical and the cosmic. It is a place in the east towards where the sun rises. It is a pure, bright, holy place. It is the place where Enki has his dwelling, from where the sweet waters of Apsu flow. Although Dilmun was historically identified with Bahrain, a relatively flat island, the mythical Dilmun shares the characteristics of the cosmic mountain. It is a point of origin, a place of primordial purity, a connection between the divine and the terrestrial. Perhaps the identification with Bahrain was secondary. Perhaps the Sumerians projected onto a real island, famous for its freshwater springs, qualities that originally belonged to a more abstract cosmic concept. Or perhaps both things coexisted, Dilmun the geographical place and Dilmun the cosmic archetype. The same could be said of Eden. Was it a specific geographical place, perhaps in the submerged valley of the Persian Gulf? Or was it a cosmic geography, the celestial prototype that the temple attempted to replicate, or both at once? The ancients did not make the sharp distinction that we make between the physical and the symbolic, between the literal and the metaphorical. A place could be both things simultaneously. The real mountain where the river was born could also be the cosmic mountain where the gods dwelt. The geographical map and the spiritual map overlapped, intertwined like the roots of an ancient tree, drawing sustenance from the same source. This is one of the reasons why it is so difficult to locate Eden on a modern map. It is not that the biblical authors were being deliberately vague or misleading. It is that they were operating with an understanding of space different from ours. For them, to say that Eden was in the east, from where the Tigris and Euphrates flow, was to give a precise location and at the same time speak of realities that transcend mere cartography. It was a statement rooted in earthly understanding, yet reaching for the heavens. The rivers themselves were not just waterways, but arteries of a divine creation, pulsing with the very lifeblood of existence. Consider now another tradition that mentions a primordial mountain. The Persian. In Zoroastrian cosmology, at the beginning of time, there existed a mountain called Barisati, the High Mountain. From it sprang all the waters of the world, and on its slopes grew the Gau Karina tree, the white tree of immortality. Whoever ate of its fruits would live forever. The parallels with Eden are evident. A mountain from which waters flow, a tree of life, the promise of immortality. The Persians and the Hebrews were drawing maps of the same spiritual territory, charting the same inner landscapes. But there is more. The Persian word for the walled garden of the king, paradisa, as we mentioned before, is the origin of our word paradise. And these Persian royal gardens were designed to evoke the primordial garden. They had water channels that flowed in 4 directions, representing the 4 rivers of origin. They had fruit trees and aromatic plants, a symphony of senses meant to transport the visitor to a state of blissful harmony. They were earthly replicas of the celestial garden, microcosms reflecting the macrocosm. The Persian kings, in building their paradisa, were doing something similar to what the Israelites did with the temple, recreating the primordial sacred space, bringing heaven to earth, restoring in miniature what had been lost on a grand scale. This practice continued in the Islamic world. The gardens of the Alhambra in Granada, the gardens of the Taj Mahal in Agra, the gardens of the Ottoman palaces, all follow the same pattern. 4 channels of water flowing from a central source, dividing the garden into 4 quadrants. Its Eden-made landscape, paradise translated into architecture, a testament to humanity's enduring longing for a lost state of grace. And not only in the East. Medieval European gardens, the cloisters of monasteries, frequently followed the same design. For paths that intersect in the center, a fountain or a tree at the point of intersection, the garden as an image of the lost Eden. The image was not just a decorative choice, but a deliberate attempt to recreate a sacred space, a haven for contemplation and spiritual renewal. Humanity, throughout millennia in diverse cultures, has tried again and again to recreate paradise, to build the cosmic mountain, to plant the tree of life, to make the waters flow in 4 directions, a universal striving echoing through the ages. Why this obsession? Why this persistent longing? Perhaps because we remember, even if we do not know that we are remembering, a faint echo resonating within our souls. Perhaps because we carry inscribed somewhere deep within us the intuition that there was a time and a place where things were right, where heaven and earth touched, where life flowed without obstacles, a harmonious existence forever imprinted on our collective consciousness. And perhaps because we hope against all evidence that that time and that place can be recovered. The cosmic mountain continues to call us, a siren song luring us towards the divine. Paradise continues to draw us eastward, upward, inward. We have traveled tonight through Sumeria, Israel, Persia, Mesopotamia. We have read cuneiform tablets and Hebrew scrolls. We have listened to Gilgamesh seeking immortality and to Enoch visiting the celestial garden. And everywhere we have found the same story told with different words. A perfect place in the beginning, a loss, a longing for return. How do we explain this coincidence? Why do so many cultures, separated by centuries and kilometers, tell variations of the same story? There are several theories, and tonight we will explore them all without pretending that anyone has the last word. The first theory is cultural diffusion. According to this explanation, the stories of paradise did not arise independently in each culture. They were transmitted from one to another, traveling along trade routes, adapting to new contexts. Merchants not only transported spices and metals, they transported stories, memes that spread like wildfire, shaping the cultural landscape. A myth told in UR could reach Haran, from Haran to Damascus, from Damascus to Memphis, each retelling imbuing the story with new nuances, new interpretations, yet preserving the essence of the original narrative. We know that this occurred. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, was translated from Sumerian into Akkadian and from Akkadian into other languages of the ancient East. Fragments have been found in Hattusa, the capital, and Tita, hundreds of kilometers from Mesopotamia, tangible evidence of the story's journey through time and space. The myths traveled, and we know that the Hebrews had extensive contact with Mesopotamian cultures, a constant exchange of ideas, beliefs, and narratives. According to the biblical account, Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldees, a Sumerian city. Centuries later, the Jews were exiled to Babylon, where they lived for decades surrounded by temples and libraries containing the ancient traditions, immersed in a cultural melting pot that shaped their identity. It is perfectly plausible that they knew the stories of Dilmun, of Gilgamesh, of the Garden of the Gods, and that these influenced how they told their own stories. This theory does not imply that the Hebrews simply copied, that their narratives were mere carbon copies of older traditions. They could know the Mesopotamian traditions and transform them according to their own theology, infusing them with their unique understanding of the divine. Genesis is not a copy of the Sumerian myths. It is something different, with its own perspective on God, on human beings, on sin and salvation, but it could have used shared narrative materials, building upon existing foundations. Cultural diffusion explains the similarities, but does it explain all the similarities? Does it explain why cultures that had no direct contact, such as the Norse with their Asgard or the Chinese with their Kunlun, also have stories of primordial paradises, isolated narratives echoing the same fundamental themes? Here enters the second theory, the psychological archetype. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, proposed that there exist universal mental structures that he called archetypes, primordial patterns that shape the way we perceive the world. These archetypes are innate patterns that mold how humans experience and narrate reality, universal symbols encoded in our very being. The lost paradise would be one of these archetypes, an image that arises spontaneously in all cultures because it corresponds to something fundamental in the human psyche, a deep-seated longing for wholeness and harmony. According to this theory, we do not need to assume contact between cultures to explain the similarities. The myths of paradise arise independently because all humans share the same mental structure, the same inner landscape shaped by the collective unconscious. The child who fantasizes about a safe and perfect place, a refuge from the harsh realities of the world. The adult who remembers with nostalgia an idealized childhood, a golden age untainted by the complexities of adulthood. The elder who laments the loss of a simpler world, a bygone era of innocence and purity. All are expressing the same archetype, the yearning for a lost state of grace, a primal longing for reunion with the source. The Jungian theory has appeal, but it also has its critics. Do these universal archetypes really exist, or is it that Jung, as a European of the 20th century, projected onto all cultures patterns that were specific to his own, influenced by his own cultural background and biases? The debate continues, an endless cycle of questions and counter-questions. There is a third, more speculative but fascinating theory, ancestral memory. According to this explanation, the stories of paradise are neither cultural diffusion nor psychological archetypes. They are memories, echoes of real events that affected the ancestors of all these cultures, and that were transmitted generation after generation until they crystallized into myth, a collective memory encoded in narrative form. We have already explored one version of this theory, the hypothesis of the submerged valley of the Persian Gulf. If there really existed a fertile oasis that the sea swallowed thousands of years ago, and if the communities that inhabited it migrated and dispersed, carrying with them the memory of what was lost, then the stories of paradise could be the echo of a real event, a distant reverberation of a bygone era. This theory has a romantic appeal. It suggests that the myths, however fantastic they may seem, have a nucleus of historical truth, a kernel of reality obscured by layers of embellishment. The dragon of European legends could be the memory of dinosaurs, a terrifying relic from a prehistoric past. The stories of the universal flood could recall real floods, catastrophic events that reshaped the ancient world. The lost paradise could be a place that really existed, a tangible landscape now lost to the ravages of time. But we must be careful, treading lightly on the fragile ground of historical reconstruction. Human memory, especially memory transmitted orally for millennia, is extraordinarily plastic, susceptible to distortion and embellishment. Details are added, modified, lost. What began as the memory of a green valley can become, after hundreds of generations, a garden of precious stones guarded by winged beings, a fantastical landscape born from the seeds of a real place. Extracting the historical core of a myth is extraordinarily difficult, perhaps impossible, a quest to unearth the truth buried beneath layers of narrative and cultural interpretation. Furthermore, this theory has a geographical limitation. The Valley of the Persian Gulf could explain the myths of paradise in Mesopotamia and its areas of influence, but what about cultures that never had contact with that region? Do the Norse myths of paradise, the Polynesian myths of sunken ancestral lands, the Amerindian myths of primordial golden ages also remember the Persian Gulf? Probably not, which suggests that either there are multiple real events behind multiple myths, or something different is happening, a more complex and nuanced interplay of factors. Perhaps the answer is a combination of all these theories, a synthesis of diverse perspectives. Perhaps some myths of paradise arose from memories of real places that were lost due to climate change or geological events, landscapes that were transformed by the forces of nature. Perhaps others arose from cultural contact, from stories that traveled and adapted, evolving with each retelling. And perhaps all are fueled by something universal in the human psyche, a need to believe that there was a better time and that it could return, a fundamental human longing for wholeness and belonging. The myths are not lies, nor are they journalistic reports. They are something in between, truths dressed in narrative, deep intuitions expressed in concrete images, archetypal stories that resonate with the human experience. The lost paradise may not be a place that exists on any map, but the experience that it expresses, the feeling that something has been lost, that we are exiled from where we should be, that experience is absolutely real. We all know it. We have all felt at some point that the world is not as it should be, that there is a crack in things, that something is missing, a profound sense of incompleteness. The ancients called that something paradise. They placed it in the east on a mountain, in a garden, a place of unimaginable beauty and harmony. They put cherubim at its entrance and rivers flowing from its center, guardians of a sacred space. We perhaps use other names. We speak of alienation, of nostalgia, of the human condition, but we are describing the same thing, the universal human experience of longing for a lost state of grace. The ultimate question is not whether Eden existed geographically. The question is, why does its loss hurt us so much, even if we do not remember it consciously? Why do we long for a place where we have never been? Why do the stories of paradise, told 4,000 years ago on clay tablets, still move us tonight, resonating with our deepest emotions and aspirations? Perhaps because we are not remembering a place. We are remembering a possibility, a way of being that we intuit but have not achieved, a home that we seek even if we do not know exactly what we are seeking, a primal longing for a lost connection to the divine. The lost paradise is not only in the past. It is in the future that we long for, in the present that could be different. It is in ourselves waiting to be found, a dormant potential waiting to be awakened. Science does not confirm myths, nor does it necessarily refute them. What it does is offer a different perspective, a set of tools to examine the same questions that the ancients asked, but from another angle, a new lens through which to view the ancient narratives. What can modern science tell us about the lost paradise? Let's start with what we know for sure, the bedrock of verifiable data. The climate of the Earth has changed dramatically over the millennia, a constant cycle of warming and cooling, shaping the landscapes and influencing the course of human history. The last glaciation reached its peak approximately 26,000 years ago, when enormous ice sheets covered much of Europe and North America, transforming the continents into frozen wastelands. During that period, the sea level was about 120 meters lower than today, exposing vast stretches of land that are now submerged beneath the waves, revealing lost landscapes and forgotten worlds. Coasts that are now submerged were then dry land, fertile plains teeming with life. Valleys that are now seabeds were then habitable, offering refuge to early human settlements. The Persian Gulf, with its average depth of only 50 meters, would have been completely dry, a vast expanse of land stretching towards the horizon. The evidence for this is incontrovertible, a mosaic of data meticulously assembled by scientists from various disciplines. Geologists have analyzed the sediments on the bottom of the Gulf and have found remains of terrestrial vegetation, of freshwater, of environments that could not exist under the sea, tangible remnants of a lost world. They have mapped ancient riverbeds that meander across the seabed, submerged continuations of the Tigris and Euphrates, the lifeblood of Mesopotamia, now hidden beneath the waves. They have dated marine and terrestrial shells to establish when saltwater reached each area, a precise timeline of the gradual inundation. The story that the sediments tell is clear. 14,000 years ago, the Gulf began to flood, a slow and inexorable process. It was a gradual process, not a sudden catastrophe, a slow-motion apocalypse. The water advanced a few meters per year, sometimes less, a barely perceptible shift. A person who lived in the valley would not have seen the sea swallow his home from one day to the next, but over the course of a human life, the change would have been perceptible, a gradual erosion of the familiar world. And over several generations, it would have been devastating, transforming the landscape and forcing communities to adapt or perish. 10,000 years ago, the Gulf was approximately half its current extent. 8,000 years ago, it had reached almost its present size. By the time the first Sumerian scribes began to record their stories, the valley had been underwater for millennia, a distant memory fading into the mists of time. This chronology poses a challenge to the theory of ancestral memory. Can a memory survive 8,000 years of oral transmission, remaining intact through countless retellings and cultural transformations? Skeptics say no, arguing that the passage of time inevitably distorts and erodes even the most vivid memories. Optimists point to documented cases of oral traditions that seem to preserve information about very ancient events, such as the Australian Aboriginal stories about rising sea levels. Narratives passed down through generations that describe the submersion of coastal lands. What we can say is that geology confirms that there existed a place in the region that the ancient texts point to, a place that would have been habitable and fertile when the rest of Arabia was becoming desert, a refuge, an oasis, perhaps for its inhabitants a paradise, a haven of life in a harsh and unforgiving world. Underwater archaeology offers some additional clues, although fragmentary, tantalizing glimpses of a lost civilization. As we mentioned before, structures have been detected under the waters of the Gulf that some researchers interpret as possible remains of human activity, submerged settlements and ancient artifacts. But the interpretation is controversial, and systematic exploration is difficult, hindered by the challenging underwater environment. What does exist in abundance are archaeological sites on the current coasts of the Gulf that date from the period immediately after the flood, settlements that emerged as the rising waters forced communities to higher ground. In Bahrain, excavations have revealed a flourishing civilization that archaeologists identify with Dilmun, a vibrant hub of trade and culture. Temples, dwellings, monumental tombs, cylindrical seals that show commercial contact with Mesopotamia, tangible evidence of a thriving society. The archaeological Dilmun is not a mythical paradise. It is a historical society with its economy, its politics, its everyday problems, a real civilization with its own unique culture and challenges. But it is interesting that the Sumerians who traded actively with this Dilmun also described it in mythical terms as the pure place, the place where there is no disease or death, an idealized vision of a distant land. Perhaps they projected onto a real place qualities that belonged to an older concept, a nostalgic longing for a lost state of grace. Perhaps the historical Dilmun inherited the name and reputation of an earlier Dilmun, now submerged, or perhaps the myth and the reality were always intertwined, as they are in so many aspects of the human experience, a complex interplay of fact and fiction. Paleoclimatology, the study of ancient climates, adds another layer to our understanding, revealing the dramatic environmental shifts that shaped the ancient world. We know that Arabia was not always the desert that it is today, a vast expanse of arid land. During certain periods of the past, known as Arabian pluvial periods, the peninsula received much more abundant rainfall, transforming the landscape into a verdant paradise. There were lakes where today there are dunes, vast bodies of water teeming with life. There were rivers where today there are dry wadis, ephemeral waterways that only flow after the occasional rainfall. There were savannas where today there are rock and sand, a diverse ecosystem supporting a rich variety of flora and fauna. The most recent of these wet periods ended approximately 5,000 years ago, a relatively recent shift in geological time. Before that, Arabia was a much greener place, capable of sustaining significant human populations, a land of opportunity and abundance. Cave paintings found in Arabia show scenes of hunting, of grazing, of a life that would be impossible in the current climate, vivid depictions of a bygone era. This climate change, combined with the rise in sea level, would have radically transformed the experience of the communities that inhabited the region, creating a period of intense upheaval and adaptation. Lands that were fertile became arid, forcing communities to migrate and seek new resources. Valleys that were refuges were submerged, swallowed by the rising waters. The world that their ancestors knew disappeared, replaced by a new and unforgiving environment. Isn't this exactly the experience that the myths of the lost paradise describe? A perfect place that existed before, a time of abundance and harmony. An irreversible loss, a tragic event that shattered the idyllic world. An exile to a harsher world, a struggle for survival in a new and challenging landscape. Science cannot confirm that the biblical Eden or the Sumerian Dilmun were memories of this specific submerged valley, a definitive link between myth and reality. There are too many unknowns, too many layers of transmission and transformation between the real events and the texts that we have, but it can confirm that the region had the conditions for such a memory to form, the potential for a myth to take root. There was a place. There was a loss. The rest is interpretation, a process of constructing meaning from the fragments of the past. Genetics offers another interesting perspective, a glimpse into the movement of populations in the ancient world. DNA studies of current populations in the Persian Gulf and adjacent regions show patterns of migration and mixing that are consistent with population movements during and after the period of flooding, revealing the complex dynamics of ancient societies. People who lived in low-lying areas would have migrated towards the coasts, towards the highlands, mixing with other populations, sharing their genes and their stories, creating a new blend of cultures. But genetics cannot tell us what stories these people told. It cannot tell us if they remembered a green valley that the sea swallowed. It can only show that they moved, that they mixed, that they survived, resilient communities adapting to a changing world. And finally, what about the possibility of finding direct evidence, tangible proof of a lost civilization? Could we one day excavate under the waters of the Gulf and find the remains of the lost paradise, unearthing the secrets hidden beneath the waves? Technically, it is not impossible, a tantalizing prospect that fuels the dreams of archaeologists. Underwater archaeology has advanced enormously in recent decades, developing new technologies and techniques to explore submerged sites. Shipwrecks have been excavated, submerged cities have been discovered, prehistoric structures have been unearthed in coastal waters, revealing hidden treasures and providing insights into the lives of our ancestors. But the Persian Gulf presents particular challenges, daunting obstacles that make underwater exploration difficult. Turbid waters, strong currents, thick sediments that cover any ancient remains, all conspire to obscure the past, hindering the efforts of archaeologists. In addition, the political conditions of the region do not always facilitate international research, limiting access to the sites and hindering collaborative efforts. Wars, border tensions, access restrictions have limited what archaeologists can do, hindering the progress of research. But perhaps someday, perhaps with new technologies, new agreements, new political will, we will overcome these challenges and unlock the secrets of the Gulf. Perhaps we will find what is hidden under those waters, unearthing the remains of a lost paradise. Or perhaps we will find nothing, a disappointing outcome that would still provide valuable insights. Perhaps time and the sea have erased every physical trace, leaving no tangible evidence of a submerged civilization. Perhaps paradise only exists now in the words that remember it, in the stories that have been passed down through generations. But even if that is the case, the words matter, the myths matter. The stories that humans tell themselves about themselves shape how they live, what they value, what they expect, influencing their beliefs, their behaviors, and their aspirations. The lost paradise, whether or not it exists on some seabed, exists in our collective imagination, and that in some way makes it real, a powerful symbol of hope, loss, and the enduring human spirit. There is a question that underlies everything we have explored tonight, a fundamental inquiry into the very nature of human existence. A question that the ancients formulated in their myths and that we continue to formulate with different words, a timeless search for meaning and purpose. Why does human life feel incomplete? We have food, but we continue to hunger for something that food does not satiate, a deeper form of nourishment. We have company, but we continue to feel a loneliness that no company completely dispels, a sense of isolation that permeates our being. We have achievements, pleasures, moments of beauty, and yet, deep down, an uneasiness persists, a lingering sense that something is missing, that this is not all there is, that we should be somewhere else, a profound sense of displacement. Philosophers have given many names to this experience, attempting to capture its essence with words. The existentialists called it angst or nausea, a feeling of unease in the face of existence. The romantics called it Sehnsucht, a longing for something that cannot be named, a yearning for an unattainable ideal. The theologians have called it the weight of the fall, the wound of original sin, a separation from the divine. The ancients called it the exile from paradise, a separation from a state of grace. And perhaps they are all talking about the same thing, attempting to articulate a fundamental aspect of the human condition, the inherent sense of incompleteness that drives our search for meaning. Because the myth of the lost paradise is not just a story about the past. It is a description of the present human condition, a reflection of our deepest longings and anxieties. We live as exiles, separated from a primal state of harmony. We live feeling that there is a home from which we come and to which we cannot return, a deep-seated longing for belonging. We live with nostalgia for a place that perhaps we have never known, but that we would recognize if we saw it, a sense of familiarity that resonates within our souls. This experience is so universal that it is difficult to attribute it simply to a particular story, a specific cultural narrative. Not only the heirs of the biblical tradition feel this longing, but humans across cultures and throughout history. Also those who have never heard of Adam and Eve feel it. Children who don't yet know any myths feel it. People in completely different cultures feel it. It's as if exile is inscribed in our nature, as if to be born human is to be born outside of paradise. Where does this feeling come from? Evolutionary psychologists propose materialistic explanations. They say that chronic discontent is an adaptation that drove us to survive. The ancestors who were content with what they had didn't seek more, didn't explore, didn't innovate. Those who always wanted something better moved, strived, and passed on their genes. Insatiable longing is the engine of cultural evolution. There may be some truth in this, but the explanation seems incomplete. It doesn't explain why the longing feels like longing for something specific, for a place, for a state, for a way of being that we sense even though we haven't experienced it. It is a persistent whisper in the back of our minds, a half-forgotten memory of a home we can't quite place. We feel the weight of absence, the ache of a profound disconnect, a sense that something essential is missing from our lives. Mystics of all traditions offer another explanation. They say that longing is the memory of the origin, that we come from some place, from a primordial unity, from a connection with the divine that was broken at birth into this world of separation. The soul remembers where it comes from and longs to return. Plato recounted something similar with his myth of the cave and his doctrine of reminiscence. The soul, before incarnating, contemplated the pure forms, absolute beauty, unadulterated truth. Then it fell into the body and forgot almost everything. But when it sees something beautiful in this world, it vaguely remembers the beauty it contemplated before. The longing is the memory of lost contemplation. The Genesis tells its own version. There was a time when we walked with God in the cool of the evening. There was a place where the earth gave its fruit without effort, where there was no death or pain, nor the shame that makes us hide from each other. A time of innocence, of unburdened joy, of unbroken communion. That time ended, that place was closed, but we remember it even if we don't know that we are remembering it. All these explanations, the evolutionary, the mystical, the philosophical, the biblical, capture something. None exhausts the mystery, and perhaps the mystery is not to be exhausted, but to be inhabited. Because the longing for paradise is not only a source of suffering, it is also a source of creativity, of search, of transcendence. It is what drives us to create art, to seek knowledge, to build communities, to love. It's the ember of a forgotten fire, a spark of divinity yearning to be rekindled. If we were perfectly satisfied with what we have, we would do none of this. Exile is painful, but it is also fertile. The Sumerians, exiled from their mythical paradise, built ziggurats that touched the sky. The Hebrews, exiled from Eden, built a tabernacle where the divine presence could dwell among them. The Persians, longing for the primordial garden, created earthly gardens that evoked it. They sought to recapture, in miniature, the lost splendor, the perfect harmony of creation. And we tonight tell stories about what is lost, which is another way to keep it alive. Perhaps paradise is not only something we lost, perhaps it is also something we are building. Each time we create beauty, we are recreating a fragment of Eden. Each time we act with justice, we are restoring a bit of the primordial order. Each time we love, we are reuniting what was separated. Every act of kindness, every gesture of compassion, every striving for truth, is a brick in the edifice of a new Eden. The Jewish mystic Isaac Luria taught that in the beginning, divine light filled all space. But to create the world, God had to contract, withdraw, leaving a void where the finite could exist. In that process of contraction, vessels that contained the light broke, and sparks of the divine were scattered throughout creation, trapped in shells of matter. The task of human beings, according to Luria, is to gather these sparks. Each act of goodness, each moment of awareness, each correct choice releases a spark and returns it to its source. When all the sparks have been gathered, the world will be repaired, the exile will be over, paradise will be restored. It's a beautiful vision, and it's not so far from what other traditions teach in their own way. Buddhism speaks of awakening from the illusion of separation. Christianity speaks of redemption that restores communion with God. Islam speaks of the garden that awaits the faithful. All these traditions recognize that something is broken and that it can be healed. The how of that healing varies. The practices, the beliefs, the paths are different, but the longing is the same. And the longing is perhaps more important than any particular doctrine, because the longing keeps us moving, keeps us from settling for less than what we could be, reminds us that we have not arrived yet, that there is more road to travel, that the exile is not the end of the story. The lost paradise hurts us, but it also calls us forward, upward, toward something that is not yet, but could be. And so we come to the end of our journey tonight. We have walked through Sumerian tablets and Hebrew scrolls. We have contemplated the Persian Gulf, imagining the green valley that perhaps existed before the waters covered it. We have listened to Gilgamesh seeking immortality and to Enoch visiting celestial gardens. We have seen how Eden was a temple and how temples were attempts to recreate Eden. And through all this, a question has remained suspended like a door waiting to be opened. Is there a way back? Genesis seems to say no. The cherubim with the flaming sword guard the entrance. Access to the tree of life is blocked. Humanity was expelled and cannot return by its own means. But the sacred texts of all traditions also speak of hope, of restoration, of a time when what is broken will be repaired and what is lost will be found. The Hebrew prophets glimpsed that day. Isaiah described a time when the wolf would dwell with the lamb, when children would play beside the viper's den without danger. It's the language of Dilmun, the language of the primordial paradise where violence did not exist. But Isaiah placed it in the future, not in the past. Paradise was not only memory, it was promise. Ezekiel saw the future temple with the river of life flowing from its interior, healing the dead waters of the salt sea, making the deserts fruitful. It is Eden restored on a cosmic scale with its waters that give life wherever they flow. The Apocalypse of John, at the end of the New Testament, closes the circle explicitly. The New Jerusalem descends from heaven, and in its center is the tree of life, no longer guarded by cherubim, but accessible to all, bearing fruit each month with leaves that are for the healing of the nations. The river of water of life flows crystal clear from the throne of God. It is Eden, but more than Eden. It is the primordial paradise elevated to its fullness. Not a garden, but a city. Not two people, but countless multitudes. Not the beginning of the story, but its consummation. And between the beginning and the end, between the Eden lost and the Eden restored, is the present time, the time of exile, the time of longing, our time. What do we do while we wait? What do we do in this interval between loss and recovery? perhaps the same as humans have done since they began to tell these stories. We remember, we hope. We build small paradises where we can, gardens that evoke the garden, communities that anticipate the community, moments of beauty that prefigure total beauty.